It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. Got a fascinating show for you today, as usual. Okay, it's a brand new book, just came out in June. I think it was June 8th. Trine Day, good old Chris Milligan over there at Trine Day Press, and Julie Cox, who always helps me book my guests when I'm looking for a good guest to get. Remember the Liberty, almost sunk by treason on the high seas. We have Philip F. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, are you there?
Yes, sir. I sure am.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Why don't you tell us about yourself? Who is Philip Nelson?
Well, I was raised in the Midwest in Indiana. I went to college in Wisconsin, and I lived my life. Well, after college, I went into the Peace Corps for 2 years, and then when I came out, they had just changed the draft in a rather drastic way to go to a lottery system.
Right.
And I was fortunate enough to draw a high number, so I missed the opportunity to go to Vietnam. And that's, it was sort of engineered, I guess. But I suspected the new president, Lyndon Johnson, of all along, actually, even before JFK was assassinated. He had been in the newspapers in 1962 and 63 repeatedly with scandal after scandal involving Billy Salesses and then it was called Bobby Baker. And so when Johnson became president, I was always suspicious of him, and that I guess I still am, aren't I? Yeah. And so after a life in the insurance business, I was wound up in the property casualty insurance business, working for two different companies, and had gotten to the vice presidential level in the process of these companies, both of which sort of, I was downsized twice because these companies began floundering because of mismanagement at the top. And so anyway, that is what it is and was. And I was fortunate to have survived that, I guess. And I went into business for myself after that for a few years. And then in 2007, I made a decision that I wanted to begin researching the JFK assassination, for starters. And that actually came about as a result of seeing the videos back in 2003, on the series "The Men Who Killed Kennedy." When I saw, especially the very last video called "The Guilty Men," starring none other than Lyndon B. Johnson, and I was fascinated by that topic because I had always had the suspicion in the back of my mind that he had to be somehow involved. Well, I shouldn't say always. In the immediate aftermath, for the first 2 years or so, I did not want to believe it was anything other than a lone nut, and it was just a frightening thought. I think I shared with most contemporary people who lived through that. It was just too frightening to even think. So it was an unthinkable thought for a lot of us. But as other people, other early researchers got into it and began identifying all the anomalies and the unexplained coincidences, and then many people started turning up murdered to a much greater degree than would realistically, be plausible.
Sure.
And I had growing doubts that, the full story was out there. So I began an intensive review of all of the literature of the time. At the time, 2007, and then in 2010 is when I self-published LBJ, the mastermind of the JFK assassination. Within a few months, a New York publisher picked it up. I was going to go to them after I had some numbers to show them, but they came to me, and that was Skyhorse, came to me, and it was October of 2010, and we negotiated a contract, and they published the book then in 2011. When they did that, they took out a lot of the material that was post JFK assassination, and I agreed to that with the proviso that it was understood that I was going to write a second book, and that would be focused on LBJ and the years of his presidency and later. And so that was done. And so in 2014, the book LBJ, From Mastermind to the Colossus, was published, also by Skyhorse. Now, that book included 2 chapters dedicated to the Liberty. And I thought I was done with this story. However, it turned out that I was not quite done, because I found out many other things in the ensuing months and years, and I decided that it needed another book dedicated to just that incident, what they call an incident. It was a massacre. It was an atrocity. But anyway, so I managed to become acquainted with 3 of the survivors who agreed to go in with me on this book and become co-authors. And they are Phil Turney, Ernie Gallo, and Ron Kukl. They were all survivors, and they all contributed to this new book. Probably close to 50% of the book were stories coming from them, either in their own words or paraphrased by me. And the remaining had to do with putting the context, the overall context, into place, and to try to bring some coherence to an otherwise very complicated story that's just full of a lot of details that detract from writing something that is an easy read. But that was always my goal, to make it an easy read, and I believe we've accomplished that.
Well, let me ask you this. These 3 men you described a minute ago, what was their role on the USS Liberty? Okay, well, Ernie Gallo, who is presently the president of the Liberty Veterans Association, he was in the cryptology division. In other words, he worked for NASA. Okay. And even though they were all Navy men, that some of them were assigned to working, in this top secret cryptology section, and that's where he worked. Also, Ron Kukl was similarly working there, but he was had a more of a job in the machinery that ran all of that. Okay. Yeah, and Phil Turney was basically a fireman. He was damage control, and trained in all the ways that can be trained to put out fires and or leaks or whatever was going on. So he was very intimately familiar with all the mechanics of that ship. And in the aftermath, Ron Kukl was he was a chief petty officer, and he was put in charge once they got to Malta. He was put in charge of going into that CT compartment in the front. That's the only place where the seawater managed to get in and drown everybody who was in there, and they were all in the CT division, cryptologists. And when that happened, when the torpedo exploded there, or outside the ship, we'll get into that later, but it killed 25 more men. There were already 9 dead on the upper decks who were killed in the immediate attack. I mean, when the fighter jets came in and started shooting up the upper deck, and subsequently dropping napalm and continuing the cannon fire and the missiles and everything else. Well, nine guys were killed there. So altogether, 34 men were killed. 174 were injured. Some of them very, very critically. It was amazing they were able to survive at all because of the enormous injuries.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. But give me an idea now. I know very little bit about the story. What I know is that the USS Liberty was attacked by Israel, supposedly by accident. What was, at the time, what was the official story that came out?
Well, the official story was, where do I start with that? It was basically a huge cover-up. In other words, none of the truth was acknowledged, and all of it was patched together, basically lies. And that's not just me talking, by the way.
Sure.
I am referencing when I make that assertion. That is precisely what the guy who was put in charge of writing the Court of Inquiry's report, Captain Ward Boston Jr., was put in charge of that, and he was working under a rear admiral named Isaac Kidd. And together, the two of them were given 7 days to complete this report, and they were told exactly what the report was going to say, and it was going to say that it was a complete accident, and it was just a very unfortunate situation, and that was the end of it. That was their orders, and those orders came from Lyndon Johnson through the Joint Chiefs and Robert McNamara, the Secretary of Defense at the time, down through John S. McCain, Admiral John McCain II. He was the father of the current senator in Arizona. And then from McCain, it came on down through the chain of command, basically personified by this Isaac Kidd, Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, and Captain Ward Boston. They conducted interviews with all the survivors, and in the process, after they had interviewed them, and this was actually all these interviews that I'm referring to now were done personally by this Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd. And he, after he interviewed them, he was interviewing them in groups of 5 or 6. So you go from one group to the next, and he would put on the same presentation. Basically, he would. This was in the days immediately after the attack. Now, this is within the first week. They were conducted while the ship was being moved from where it was attacked in the Mediterranean to Malta, where it was scheduled. It was then scheduled to be repaired. So on the way over there, he would conduct these interviews with 5 or 6 guys. We would walk in and expect to be saluted as a rear admiral, which of course they were, officer on deck, and they all came to attention and saluted and all that. And then he would remove his stars from his collar, and he clinked them on a metal table. He made sure that there was a clink because they all repeated this same story.
Wow.
And they also said that his collar had holes in them where he would, could easily put them back in the same exact hole, and then we'd take them out again. Every single time he did the same act, because what he was trying to convey there was that he's just a regular guy. Don't consider me an admiral. I'm just like you. I'm a chief petty officer, or I'm a sailor, or whatever. And whoever he was talking to, in other words, he talked to these guys in groups. He had started with the officers, of course, the captain and the lieutenants and all the commanders and so forth. And then after that, he conducted all of these with the other survivors until each and every one were subjected to this meeting. Anyway, so after he heard them and their stories, he encouraged them to he was like a favorite uncle or father figure and so on, and he was just really down to earth during this period, and he encouraged them to just spill their guts and just say whatever they wanted, and that's what they did. And then at the end he would say, well, does anybody have any questions? And so some of them would, in fact, Phil Turney, who told this story in the book, stated that yes, he raised his hand and said, why weren't we given any help? What happened to the help that was supposed to be? We got our SOS out, but there was no help coming. Well, and we're going to return to that part later, but But for the purposes here, I'm just trying to explain what happened, in these interviews. So yes, he at that point, he put his stars back on his collars, and he returned to being an admiral. He says, now I'm an admiral again. And of course, that meant show me the proper deference and don't get in my face about any of this stuff anymore. Right. And effectively telling them that, well, not effectively, he told them basically to forget everything that they've just told him. It was nice that they got it all off their chests and everything, but now you're not going to talk to anybody anymore about any of this. And that was an order, and that anybody who doesn't follow that order is subject to a prison term. And then he would say at the end of that, he would say a prison term or worse, never identifying what worse that a prison term might be. But they all imagined what it might be. And anyway, they got the message. And by the way, they were told that they couldn't even discuss it amongst themselves. One-to-one, that was off limits too. And above all, they couldn't say anything to any of their families, their wife, their children, their mother, their father, nobody. That's who they could talk to.
Now, would that be standard in a typical Navy investigation?
No. This is all the earmarks of an absolute brutal cover-up. You can imagine that these guys were just shot at, and some of them almost mortally wounded, and yet they were told that they could never talk to anybody about this. It's like, PTSD on steroids.
Right.
As Ray McGovern, I need to credit Ray McGovern with that one. He wrote the foreword of the book, and he's an ex-CIA analyst, so he knows his stuff. And that was a very good way to put that, because that's exactly what it was. And some of these guys, and in these days, you have to understand, back then, the Navy didn't even recognize PTSD. There was nothing in any of their manuals about that. So
it's more shell shock, they used to say.
Right.
Or
they were
cowards,
on their own. They were expected to deal with it and be a man about it. And don't you ever talk to anybody about it. So that's what they did. So many of them had failed marriages as a result of that. They went back and they had this torment inside of them that they couldn't. Some of them even tried to talk to their pastors about it. The confidence was expected that they could at least talk to them, and they would never reveal this. And even some of those pastors would just turn their backs on them. They'd say, "You're just crazy. I can't deal with this. It didn't happen." Because some of them actually contacted the Navy and to ask about it. No, that's just ridiculous. That didn't happen. So it was just a very brutal and absolute cover-up that was conducted. And again, that is not my words. That's Ward Boston. He wrote the report, and for over 30 years, 37 years to be exact, he kept his mouth shut. And he did not come forward and reveal the truth until 2004. And in fact, his report was done as a result of a book that had just been published by a guy named A.J. Crystal, who tried to repeat all of those lies that had been in the original Navy Court of Inquiry and put it in a book, along with a lot of other lies and myths and so forth. And his book is still out there. I mean, it's been totally destroyed by critics seeking the truth, and it's not destroyed, but it's still out there. But it's completely discredited. Well, let's just put it that way. I know of nobody who. Well, there are a lot of people who pretend they still support it. John McCain, the senator.
Yeah, I'm sure he does. Yeah.
And whoever wants to make sure that the original myth stands, well, of course they're going to cite A.J. Crystal's book, and they're going to cite a book by the former ambassador, the Israeli ambassador to the U.S., named Michael Oren, who wrote his own turgid book, saying basically the same thing. And So it just happens that in 2004, just 2 weeks after Ward Boston did this, he had to correct the record because he was furious with having seen A.J. Crystal's book and seen what had happened, that he was just adopting all these lies, that Ward Boston, along with Admiral Isaac Kidd, had documented, so-called, with quotes around it, and put in this Naval Court of Inquiry report, a report, by the way, which ignored much of the incriminating testimony taken from the actual officers who witnessed such things as the firing, the Israeli torpedo boats firing, at the lifeboats that were being deployed, because the captain had ordered a prepare to abandon ship because of when the torpedoes started flying, not flying, but coming. They thought they were goners at that point. So they put out the lifeboats, and the Israeli motor torpedo boats fired at them and destroyed them.
Let me ask you something to back up just a tiny little bit. At the time this happened, because this is enormous, 34 dead and 100 and something, you said, injured. What was being reported on the news, on TV, and the radio right after this happened?
Right. That's an excellent question, because what happened is it was reported that there was this big accident. There was an unfortunate misidentification, and Israel thought this ship was actually an an Egyptian ship and an Egyptian warship. Okay, when in fact the only ship that they could even reference was an aging Egyptian horse ferry that had been scheduled for destruction. It was not even seaworthy.
Yeah, I was going to say, what kind of navy did Egypt have in those days? Nothing, right?
They I guess they started out with something, but and we're going to get back into this one too.
Okay.
You have to remember, this is the fourth day of a 6-day war. As far as Egypt was concerned, the war was over, and it's important to understand that, because their complete air force, about 90% of it, was taken out in a surprise attack launched by Israel on the morning of June the 5th. Okay, now I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, because I'd like to go back and just kind of restart with a description of the attack itself, how it was launched and how it was synchronized, and how one wave after the other followed suit over a period of 2.5 hours. Well, a period of 2 hours of solid attack, and then there was another half an hour where two huge combat helicopters hovered over the ship, and with ropes just dropped down to the ship's deck, and they were ready to rappel down these ropes, all these combat guys, and kill off the crew, sink the ship, and then be done.
Really?
Yeah, that was, and everybody on the ship was frightened that was imminent. However, because of the presence of a Russian ship that was coming towards them, it was either that or their fear that the Sixth Fleet had been notified and they were going to be launching a squadron of fighter jets to save the Liberty. One or the other. We don't know exactly, because all the records have been expunged or just whatever.
Well, then let me ask you a question. Now, so this was a coordinated attack by land and air, by
Yes.
sea and air. Now, how long would it have taken?
Land.
I'm sorry, I meant by sea and air. But the thing is, how long would it have taken the Israelis to plan something like that?
That's a very good question, and the record shows from other authors. Now, I'm what my book does here, as I've done in 2 other cases in those previous books, is I've consolidated the findings of numerous authors before me into one kind of a unique book that blends it all together and makes it into a readable story that makes sense. I try to make sense out of all of this. And one of the other previous authors, in fact, he was not only an author of a book called Operation Cyanide, and that book, that title came from the part of the plan that had to do with the sinking of the ship. That was the Liberty. That was a subpart of a much larger plan called Frontlet 615. And that's Frontlet 615 stood for, it was a title that eventually became known as the 6-Day War. In other words, that's what it was all about. It was starting this war between Israel and Egypt and portraying it as though Egypt caused it.
Right.
And it was Egypt that had done all the provocations, which was exactly opposite of the truth.
So how long do you think it took the Israelis to plan this?
I think the plan germinated in 1965, and it lasted until it was deployed in June of '67. So they're talking about at least 2 years.
Wow.
Now, it was not just the Israeli military. It was also, and there are records which prove this assertion. It's not me rattling on about something I can't prove. Okay. I can prove it, and others have proven it before me. That it was started. That is, the planning had to begin in 1965, because by 1966 there were already U.S. military, special forces, and others in place in Israel, training their officers for what would become this war. Now, they didn't know exactly when it was going to be launched or anything like that, but the plan had to be in place. It had to have started in 1965 because all of that was going on in 1966. By mid-66, they were deployed. They were out there. They were doing that. And the other thing I want to get in here at this point is that the document that I'm referencing, when I just stated that it's not me talking, it's the other authors who have found this. Now, this document was found by accident by James Ennis. He was one of the survivors. He was an officer on the Liberty, and he wrote one of the first books, Assault on the Liberty. His book was written in 1979, I think published in 1980 in that area. And there's nothing about this document in his book. However, he does show it in a video done by the BBC. It's called a BBC documentary called Dead in the Water. Your listeners really need to check that out. It's on YouTube. Just Google in Dead in the Water, BBC documentary. It's an hour long, so you have to allocate time to watch it and be patient. It is a fascinating, it's an unbelievable video, done by the same author who wrote Operation Cyanide, Peter Howden. Now, so anyway, my point was that James Ennis had found a document in the LBJ library of all places, and it was misfiled. It was filed in what was a set of Liberty, the USS Liberty files, but it had to do with something from a group called the 303 Committee. Now, that group was a special group that was akin to the National Security Council now, or back in Kennedy's time, it was then referred to as the Special Group. And then it got changed to Special Group Augmented when Bobby Kennedy was put in charge of it. So it had a number of different names over the years. Under Nixon, it was called the 40 Group or something like that.
Yeah, so, Operation 40. Yeah.
But it was basically there to do plans on behalf of the president. So that whatever they did, they came directly from the president. So there's no question about what was going on there, and was basically at the behest of Lyndon Johnson.
So what was in the document?
Okay. The document he found, and it was just a single page, which he showed on this documentary. I think it's about the 46-minute mark on that documentary I just mentioned.
Okay.
But it lists the names of the attendees, and it was conducted. The meeting was conducted by a an officer, a General Stakely, Ralph Stakely, I think his name was, yes. And it referenced this operation that would be in the Mediterranean, and someone, whoever had this particular copy of the minutes, had written on it, or I don't know if it's the minutes or the agenda or whatever it was, it came out of this meeting, but they had written on there, submarine in UAR waters. UAR was the acronym for United Arab Republic, and that meant, at the time, that meant Egypt. Okay, so it was all related to, and it had the Frontlet 615 code on it, and it was supposed to be top secret. So the whole thing was an aberration that it was even found accidentally by James Ennis. It wasn't. I mean, he was doing his research, and he was doing very diligent research, right. I should add, in finding this. But it was always a mistake that was not supposed to be in that file. And
wait, and clarify
anyway,
for me again. What was in the document?
Well, it was just a very sketchy thing about this operation, and the fact that someone had written in there that there was going to be an operation, a sub-operation, involving a submarine in Egyptian waters, and that implicitly, you could probably say explicitly, meant the Liberty, because the document was in the Liberty files.
Right.
Okay. So, but the document was covering this other larger operation called Frontlet 615. And all it was a single piece of paper, I believe. And since it had not been in Ennis's book in 1980, I believe I had figured out that it had to be found by him around 1988, because it showed up in this later video. And I don't remember all the ways I estimated it was 1988, but it had to be in that area. It could have been 1990, but wherever. It was in there somewhere. And he showed it, and that's the only time it's been seen, because it's no longer available. And anyway, that's a document that references the 303 committee, which is Johnson's basically planning committee that was conducting all these plans and had been involved with the Israeli leadership in compiling them and propagating, and whatever you want to call it. And it's important to note that the people on his committee were of the zealously Zionist mindset who wanted this to happen. We're talking about Abe Fortas. Now, he was a sitting Supreme Court justice, yet he was still on this committee, because he was still acting as Johnson's right-hand man and legal counsel and friend and everything else. And so somehow he got into all this, and he was acting as the liaison to the Israeli leadership and coordinating all this. So there's no question about this. And Walt Rostow was another. McGeorge Bundy was on there. Robert McNamara, the Richard Helms, the head of the CIA, was on there, and there were a couple of others. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that all of them who were on that committee knew about this little other operation called Operation Cyanide involving the Liberty. However, that's the group that was coordinating the larger plan. I'm sure that the Liberty aspect was held to a much tighter standard, probably just a few people. Certainly McNamara would have known about it.
Well, let me ask you this, because we're running out of time. We only have about another 20 minutes. Now, the thing is the Israeli motivation for attacking the Liberty was to provoke the U.S. into getting into the Six-Day War, because they had already won that. What did they want us to get into?
Well, yeah, that's a very insightful and very pertinent comment you just made there, because as you suggest, or not suggest, you pointed out that this is the fourth day of a Six-Day War.
Right.
I believe that the Israelis had determined that it was no longer in their interest to actually sink the ship. I don't know. It's difficult to really sort all this out, because all the secrets that are and the files are not available and so forth. But let's put it this way: up until the war started on June the 5th, 10 days early, mind you. At that point, the Liberty was still out in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it had not gotten to its position. So when the war started, it was not in position. It was supposed to be in position because it was going to be the original plan for that plan called for the ship to be sunk on the very first day of the war, when all the action was going on against Egypt and the Egypt Air Force, and that they were bombing all the airports and so forth, our air bases, and destroying practically the entire Egyptian Air Force. And the idea was to sink that in the middle of that and then blame it on Egypt. And then the plan then called for a retaliation against Egypt. And that was a pretext that was set up for the very purpose of having Lyndon Johnson dispatch these airplanes, which you'll see if you watch the video, that I'm not making this up. It sounds outlandish, but it's true. There were two A-4 aircraft equipped with nuclear bombs headed for Cairo, okay, because that was the deal. That was supposed to be what was going to happen. The problem was the ship didn't sink as scheduled on this fourth day. At that point, after 4 days of basically Egypt's entire air force is already destroyed, I think Israel must have figured out that it was no longer plausible to put the blame on Egypt, and besides which they've already defeated Egypt. Well, they didn't need the U.S. to go there and use that as a pretext to become involved in a war that was already over with them. At that point, they were only fighting Syria and Jordan, and that was just an extended amount, that they wanted to secure additional territories, and that was rather easy pluckings, I guess, because it happened, and within 2 days, Egypt had defeated all three of these countries. Israel had defeated all three of these countries.
Right.
So to get back to your point, in my opinion, that's all it is my opinion, is that it doesn't make sense that Israel had any further motive for sinking that ship. And in fact, it would have been much more difficult for them to try to explain to anyone, including the national press or the international press, just what was going on there, and trying to blame Egypt for it. How could they do it? They have no airplanes left. And they've sort of decommissioned their entire military because they'd already started peace negotiations at the UN in New York. It made no sense at all. So someone, I think, must have realized that and was trying to pull back. And also, it would explain how those more... now, I'm going to quickly recap the nature of the attack, okay?
Okay.
At 2 o'clock Sinai time, three Mystère French-built jet fighters approached the Liberty, on an attack formation, a triangular formation, and they hit it with all kinds of heat-seeking missiles, cannon fire, regular, aircraft guns, whatever, and they would take one pass after another. After the first pass, they would circle around, do a figure eight, come back, and do another pass, and fire at it again. And then after several passes, they left the scene. But they were then well-coordinated other airplanes that were slower, called Mystères. They came in just as the first crew left, and here's the Liberty down there, all shot up. There's no flag anymore at this point. The first aircraft took out the flag, but so the second set of aircraft were slower, and they could overfly and drop napalm packets all over the deck, and get that, set them afire with more gunfire. And this went on, for several passes. And then when they left the scene, this is only about 20 minutes into the attack, 25 minutes. And by that time, the Liberty sailors were able to go out. One hero, Terry Halberdier actually got out and ran a coax cable across the decks in the middle of all this gunfire and so forth, and hooked up a cable to the only remaining transmitter that would still function, because all the rest of them were destroyed by the heat-seeking missiles. Well, the missiles never caught that one because it had not been turned on at the time, but there was no cable left to it anymore. So he had to do this, and as soon as he did, they got SOS messages out to the Sixth Fleet, calling for help. They were received, those SOS messages. And so at about 20 minutes after all the attack had started, the Sixth Fleet managed to get a number of aircraft, F-4 Phantom jets, dispatched to come to its aid, plus those two A-4s I already mentioned with the nuclear bombs on them headed for Cairo. All of this is in that video. You and your listeners should check that out.
And also, anyway, don't forget, it's in your book too.
It's in my book too.
Remember the Liberty, almost sunk by treason on the high seas, and there's a link to that book on my Facebook page, and we'll have it up in the Opperman Report bookstore as well. Continue, please.
Yes, it's just called "Remember the Liberty."
Right.
So anyway, the Phantom jets were on their way to the Liberty when word got back that they had to contact the White House. This is at about 8:20 in the morning, Washington time, and the word came back that they had already sent the aircraft out to come to the aid of the Liberty, and McNamara gets on the line and recalls them, says you've got to recall the airplanes, and the reason was that the Liberty had not sunk. They couldn't figure out why it had not sunk. Well, at that point, it had not even been hit by a torpedo. So, but the point is, all of this was going on in a rather chaotic way, because the real plan, the plan that would have happened on the first day of the war, had the ship been in place, could not be invoked. It became a mess. It was a colossal mess, and they didn't expect this radio message to get out. They were supposed to take all those antenna and the transmitters off. Right. It was not supposed to get that message out. So all of this was going on in this chaotic fashion, and it was just through a series of miracles. And the next part is, after all the airplanes were gone, then the motor torpedo boats came in and started their firing, their artillery at the Liberty as well. And then as they got closer to the ship, they fired 4 torpedoes, and all 4 of those torpedoes missed. When I just find that is amazing. If they didn't think that they could hit it because they weren't close enough, there was nothing there to prevent them from getting closer. They could have gotten as close as they wanted to get to ensure and guarantee that those torpedoes would hit, but they didn't. The first 4 did not hit at all. And a story that has been just now coming out and is covered in the book, and it's also on a YouTube documentary with a fellow named Larry Weaver who's testifying to this, stated that the 5th torpedo, the one that actually hit the ship, was ordered to be fired by none other than Lyndon Johnson. He wanted the ship sunk. And I know this is difficult for most people to comprehend, but you have to hear me out here, because all of this is just almost incomprehensible, and most of it's unspeakable or even unthinkable. But it happened, and none of this is being made up. These are all true accounts, I believe, and including this part of the story. And the only thing that makes any sense to me, and as I've described it in the book, is that Lyndon Johnson, at that point in time, even though they all had collaborated for months and even years in the lead up, and it was a 50-50 proposition between the Israeli military leadership, Johnson's White House crew, the 303 committee next door in the EOB, and the Pentagon, Robert McNamara, and et cetera. All of them, it was all need to know, of course. And I'm not saying everybody in all of those groups knew about the Liberty piece of it, but a lot of them knew about the war itself. But the Liberty piece, up until that first day, it would have been also mutually, desirable by both Johnson and Israel to have done this. However, because of the delay and the fact that the war had started before the Liberty was even on the scene, after that, Israel, I believe, lost any kind of a motive for seeing this out. I mean, it would have been almost impossible at this point to explain, to anyone how Egypt, could have been blamed for this attack.
And Johnson's motive was just get rid of the witnesses?
Well, that would have been accomplished. They would have gotten rid of the witnesses. And the rest of it, just the attack in general. But it was never the intention was never, clearly, it was never just to put it out of commission. It was to sink it and take everybody to the bottom of the Mediterranean, right. So that there would be no witnesses left to rebuke any of it. But it was, you have to understand, in 1967, first of all, you have to understand that Lyndon Johnson had a series of psychotic rages. I've documented those, referencing other works of other people, including some psychiatrists, psychologists, and people who witnessed his coming unglued at certain meetings, and that you have to factor that in. He had lost all rationality at various points. And this was even picked up by people like Arthur Schlesinger, and he repeated accounts from Richard Goodwin and Bill Moyers about this in his last book called Journals. He'd also had some in his book on Robert Kennedy. And also Richard Goodwin himself wrote a very interesting book in 1988 called Remembering America, where he had an entire chapter, I think it was chapter 26, like 45 pages, of his growing awareness of Lyndon Johnson's mental issues. I don't know how else to say it. That's what it was about. Go to the library and you read that for yourself. But unless you factor that into the equation, you will never understand exactly the mental framework that he was looking at his election chances the following year. He expected to be reelected. He thought that the White House was his destiny, had always been his destiny, and that he had a almost guaranteed right to run again and be reelected. And he wanted to ensure, just like he did 4 years before, at this point 3 years before, in 1964, with that other false flag operation called the Gulf of Tonkin attack, a phantom attack that didn't occur. He said it did, and at that time he was still believable for some reason to a lot of people. So the Congress, the House of Representatives, passed that unanimously. The Senate, there were only 2 senators who voted against the Tonkin Gulf resolution, and so the whole thing passed, and they gave him the keys to conduct that war in whatever way he wanted to, and do it on his own timetables, and micromanage the hell out of it. And that's exactly what he did. And so he looked at this as an opportunity. First of all, he was very concerned that it was Jewish people, liberal Jewish people, especially in New York, and Washington, Miami, and Los Angeles, and so forth. All the major cities had turned against him, and that's where all the protests were really emanating from, and they were all being led, at least in his mind, by young Jewish guys who were liberals and who didn't want that war, but he thought that they would go for a war over in the Middle East, and so that was his mindset. It admittedly a diluted mind, but that's you have to consider that. And he thought that this would guarantee him another landslide election in the following year, even at the risk of starting World War III. And I know it sounds absurd. A lot of people are probably, still trying to comprehend all this. But it's a real. This should have been an epic story 50 years ago. 50 years ago, this should have been in every headline in the country, of the world. I mean, it was that epic.
Why do you think the press didn't?
It was hidden.
Why do you think the press didn't cover this back then? They were covering Watergate and stuff. Why not this?
Well, Johnson had bought himself a lot of capital with his progressive legislation in the first 2 years of his presidency, and I guess there was some recognition of that, even despite his horrible Vietnam policies that they all detested so much. I don't know how to say that except for this. It was not just his own influence. It was the CIA acting with him and what had started out as Operation Mockingbird back in the early 50s,
right,
where many journalists and publishers and newspaper owners around the country, the major newspapers, were all embedded with the CIA in this Operation Mockingbird and being paid. And of course, some of their syndicated columnists, for example, all the names, they were being paid off to parrot the CIA line, and that's what happened. There's no other way around it. I'm not sure how I can add to that.
Well, I tell you, this great information. The book is Remember the Liberty, Almost Sunk by Treason on the High Seas by Philip F. Nelson. His website is lbjmastermind.com. What do you want to leave us with? How can people find you if they want to get a hold of you and book you on the air?
Well, they can contact me through my website. There's a contact information there, and that would probably be just the best way. The book is listed, of course, at Amazon and Books A Million and Barnes & Noble and in some bookstores. This is a smaller publisher, and I'm not sure how many brick-and-mortar type stores might carry it, but I believe this is a condensed version of what should have been an epic story 50 years ago, and we're still trying to deal with the consequences. Those consequences, in my view, are enormous, and you see them every day over on the Gaza Strip, and the fighting that still goes on and will go on till forevermore, probably, until somebody with a little more sanity comes onto the scene over there.
Mr. Nelson, thank you so much. The book's got great reviews. You check it out there on Amazon and also on the Opperman Report bookstore. Thank you so much, Philip Nelson.
You're welcome.